All right. Good afternoon properly, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about curiosity. We're specifically going to talk about methodologies to cultivate our own curiosity, why that's important, etc., etc. So, although I know a large portion of the audience, raise your hand if you consider yourself a newbie to InfoSec in any way, shape, or form. How many of you among those consider yourselves a newbie to InfoSec despite your many years of experience? Nice. My people. All right. And on the flip side, how many of you at any point have ever felt lost, kind of not unsure where to go with your career? Also my people. Excellent. Okay, well, shaking that miserable feeling is why we're here today. So, a little bit about myself. I am just some guy. I'm Bret Mattingly, a.k.a. Delta, a.k.a. Becky with the good hair. I am a software engineer here in Indianapolis. I'm a little baby security researcher. By that it means I write software that tries to break things and generally break things in the way that I didn't intend. And occasionally I post neat things on Twitter, so you can follow me there. Also, quick disclaimer, I am not a medical professional, and none of this is medical advice. Really quickly, this is my first talk, so I wanted to give a few shout-outs and some thanks. Sweet Cat, Odd Job, Steve Reagan, all encouraged me to submit this CFP to give this talk, so I wanted to extend my thanks to them one way or another. Parts of this talk are inspired by Lost. He gave a talk at last year's DEF CON called Hacker Fundamentals and Cutting Through Abstraction. It is a very, very cool talk, in which, not the least of which, he will walk you through the idea of simple switches, on-off switches, to transistors, all the way up into a full-blown CPU in 10 minutes. So it illustrates the power of abstraction. He talks about some other cool things. That's the hacker fundamentals part. I've got a link to that at the end so that you guys can watch that. I highly recommend it for everyone, regardless of experience. It's very rewarding and very cool. So, this is a story in 3 parts. The first part is, what is curiosity and why do we care? It's very brief. Second is a look at what gets in the way. So, I've identified 3 major impediments that can restrict or otherwise hinder our curiosity. And, of course, the last part is, what can we do about it? This is a security talk, of course, so it will include your standard quota of forced, unfunny memes. How many of us have seen or heard this quote before? So there are known knowns, there are unknown unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns. I really like this just because it's a very simple basis from which we can derive a definition for curiosity, and that is the desire to make the unknown more known. This is obviously not a very heavy psychological definition because we don't need to particularly get into that too much today, but it serves our purposes. But more importantly, why do we care, right? And fortunately, in the InfoSec field, we have a lot of valid justifications for caring about our curiosity and continuing to cultivate it. Do I have any sysadmins, NOC, SOC operations folks? Excellent. So, if you've ever encountered an incident or an outage, I imagine you've got a written or unwritten diagnostic checklist that you start running through in your head a little bit. How much of that generally involves figuring out what the heck you know and just kind of getting your bearings of the situation? Good, we're going to use that. So if you're curious about your infrastructure as well when there's not problems, it's great for problem prevention, right? If you go poking around or doing some sort of adversarial thinking, you can find problems before they happen. In skill development in general, right? Obviously, when many of us said we were lost in our careers, I certainly feel that. Knowing where to go next or figuring out what we want to learn, what we want to cultivate, Curiosity is invaluable in that, right? There is great value in poking around things that you may or may not want to continue pursuing, and you can't really do that without exploring them at least a little bit. And finally, we've got disciplines within the field that are almost completely curiosity-driven, right? So pen testing, vulnerability research, digital forensics, some incident response, malware analysis, that kind of thing. A lot of the work in these fields requires you putting yourself in a new or unfamiliar environment on a regular basis. And if you don't have curiosity, if you don't have that exploratory drive, you are functionally dead in the water, right? So with that out of the way, let's talk about what impedes curiosity. Like I said, I've identified 3 major traits that have an effect on curiosity. They are all personality traits, and the important thing to note is they're all personality traits with practical use. This is not a binary thing. It's about keeping them in balance. In psychology, which is probably the only time we'll talk about psychology in this speech, in this talk, there is a theory about the nature of curiosity and where it comes from. It's called the optimal arousal theory. It is not as fun as it sounds. It states that the desire that fuels curiosity comes from maintaining an optimal level of interest. So balance between not too interesting, not too boring. Similarly, with these personality traits, it's about keeping them in balance. So let's start exploring those. I'm going to start with my favorite of the 3. And that is ego. Fortunately, I'm very new to the InfoSec world, and so nobody in this room has known me for a very long time. I used to be an egotistical jackass in my youth, so I know the dangers and the follies of the ego very well. And ego, when it gets discussed, is interesting because it almost always, unless we're talking that clinical or psychological connotation, is almost talked about negatively, right? Like I just said, egotistical jackass, that guy's an egomaniac, has head's too big, et cetera, et cetera. But when we talk about ego, specifically we're talking about our self-concept. And that self-concept is what gets us through our day-to-day lives, right? So the positive aspects of a healthy self-concept, of an ego that's well-balanced, is that it allows us to be confident in our abilities, right? It allows us to know what we can take on. So you can say, okay, I have a pretty good idea of the things I know. I can step up to this. Or I know that this particular challenge is going to be going outside my comfort zone. So I can take it on. Because of that, it gives us the ability to move onward and upward, right? But be it in our hobbies, career, what have you. And then there's the downsides. Too much ego, a overinflated sense of self-concept, whether we're aware of it or not, can lead to tunnel vision and clouded judgment. And because of that, can lead to frustration. If we think we're better than a problem, if we think we should know something, that can kind of make things a little short-sighted for us, and makes it difficult to go forward and certainly to explore. The effects of a self-concept that is perhaps underinflated is the dreaded imposter syndrome, which many, many people have talked about in much more detail and to better ends than I have. But this is what happens when we don't take stock of where we're at. We don't have a authentic, real self-concept. And then that worry, that imposter syndrome creeps in. So go ahead and raise your hand if you've ever said or thought any of the following. This is below me, or this is stupid. I feel like I should know this already. I don't want to do this. I don't want to feel dumb. Or I'm not good enough for this. I'm not smart enough for this. I'm not pretty enough for this, etc. So obviously the first 3 are what happens when we let our ego expand a little bit too much and get the better of us. And of course the last is the opposite problem. We'll talk about how we start remedying that here shortly. Impediment number 2 is likely to raise some eyebrows. And again, keeping in mind that this is about keeping things in balance. Obviously there is almost nothing negative about having experience itself. So here we're talking about reliance on experience. There is a reason experience is so valued in the professional field. It allows us to recognize patterns, right? That ability to recognize patterns can inform our future decisions. Companies put experienced individuals in decision-making positions because they want to get it right the first time. And a person who has that experience, who has seen a lot of these patterns, is more likely to get it right the first time. These are the guys that are making big money losing or gaining decisions, and that's expensive. The downside of relying on experience is, once again, when we allowed it to get in the way of our judgment. So is anybody familiar with the term cargo cult programming in particular? Okay, I see one hand, so I'll briefly explain it. Again, my background is in software engineering. This is something we hear a lot. So the story of the cargo cults is actually very interesting. In World War II, we had soldiers, both from all from the Allied forces that were on the Melanesian Islands. And they would get airdrop supplies very regularly on these bases on the islands. And they would share these supplies with many of the natives. The natives were acting as their guides. Obviously, after the war ended, soldiers packed up and went home, left behind a lot of the structures and things. So some of the airfields, runways, and things like that were still there. Cargo containers being another big one. Shortly after the war, the natives began to form a religion based around the artifacts that were left behind. You would see guys go out with abandoned rifles and emulate drills and parades as best they could. Natives would carve headphones out of wood, emulating the things they'd seen because they didn't really understand it. It had just been there. So similarly, when it comes into programming, we talk about, oh, this is something we've always done, but we don't really know why. Has anybody ever had, I know we've got some college students in the audience, have we had the professor who is so brilliant and so very experienced in their field that they have a very painful time articulating like a level 100 course? Yeah. It's real bad in the sciences. And that part of that problem is that professor generally does not go back to revisit their perspective of the basics, right? They are so far beyond the basics in whatever field that they're in, they don't have to think about it that more. And so it becomes difficult to imagine it from any other way than they experienced it. Finally, the other issue with over-relying on experience is even though we work with machines that should be finite and deterministic, life just don't work that way. Blame it on the cosmic rays, but sometimes things can go wrong in a way that we hadn't done before, and if all we're relying on is, I know how to do this because I've done it before, when something new comes up, we are kind of in a rut. Stole this from Thread with Waxwing, so thank you. One of the interesting things, and we'll again talk about this more in a second, is that when you're a noob, you see all these topics in the field as just kind of individual nodes that are not really connected. Maybe you have some understanding of how they're connected, and they're all just infinitely deep, and you have no idea how to begin exploring them, connecting them. And when you're a little more experienced, obviously, you start making those connections. You can chain them together. Sometimes these ideas are hierarchical, where one leads to another as you're descending in more detail. Sometimes they're connected in very bizarre and abstract ways, or sometimes you make those analogous connections yourself. So once again, let me see some hands raised if you've ever said or thought any of the following. This is how we've always done it. I don't understand the difficulty you're having. I don't see what the problem is here. Or, I don't know. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I don't know is one of the most powerful sentences in the English language, as we're about to find out. That is obviously an example of not having a host of experience, which is fine, because then you get to learn today. The hidden catch of saying something like that's how we've always done it, or even I don't understand the difficulty you're having, is because I'm no longer thinking about it, right? And this is the hidden peril of over-reliance on experience. And finally, we have assumption. Kind of similar to experience, but doesn't require the actual experiential part. As my parents were so fond of reminding me, we know what happens when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. And throughout my childhood and really most of my adult life, that has been the case. But once again, it's about keeping things in balance, right? Assumption allows abstractions to work. If I am developing a web application, I don't necessarily have to think about how the CPU operates, right? I don't need to know. I'm going to, because I want to. But most of my fellow web dev peers or anything of the sort would not have to worry about that. Many don't think about it. Because of this, it allows our abstractions to work, and especially, again, in the web dev field, we have a lot of tools and frameworks that are built on hiding parts that we don't want to have to think about because it always works the same way until it doesn't. So because of that, it can help us keep us focused and take on different kinds of challenges and choose a better class of problem. The negative problem with assumption is if you think you know something, you're not likely going to want to learn it. I have a friend who is very guilty of this. He will often read or hear about things and think he has a cursory understanding of them, only to be surprised when he's later found out that somebody more experienced, more knowledgeable about the subject he thought he knew will correct him. He does come around, which is good, but it's better to know that you don't know than to assume that you do. The other problem with assumption is it can hurt you in other ways. I was playing around with rooting one of the Amazon Fire tablets earlier this week. I read a little too quickly. I assumed that one set of rules that applied to a firmware version applied to another, and I got shreked. So, in more than just inhibiting our curiosity, be careful of your assumptions because they can bite you in the ass. Again, raise your hand if you've ever said any of the following. I don't know, it just kind of works. I don't really think about it. Oh, shit. We're in IT. If I see a hand down for that statement, I know something's up. Even the youngins up here are like, yep. Okay. I've spent a few minutes talking about what's wrong with me. I mean, us. So now let's talk about how we fix it. Now, I've come to find that the problem of curiosity and cultivating curiosity is very similar to a creativity problem, right? One of my big hobbies is music production, and so I have struggled with this in particular for a long time, and there are a lot of analogs to how we fix this. First of my recommendations is to change your perspective, either mental or physical or both. There was a Buddhist monk by the name of Shunryu Suzuki. He is credited for popularizing Zen Buddhism in North America. And among the many sayings attributed to him is, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's, there are few. Think back to our Super Mario rabbit hole discussion. That's exactly what he's getting at there. And of course, there's a lot more wisdom in that knowledge. I'm not going to ask you, I see we've got the Zen beginner's mind up there. I'm not going to ask you to sell all your possessions and live in a forest monastery. When I finally get burnt out, I'll do that and report back to you guys in a few years. But there is a lot of knowledge in this statement and in Buddhist teachings, which is why we bring it out here, right? It's very common for teachings to take the form of a younger monk asking the elder a question that starts with why, right? Why is the world the way it is? Why do we follow the rules the way that we do? Why is there suffering? And then the elder will espouse some knowledge. That question, why, is extremely powerful. If you ever find yourself stuck, ask it until you vomit. Ask it until you sound like a toddler or an animaniac. Just why? Why? It will help you gain a very deep and very appreciative understanding of what it is you're trying to explore. We'll go through in a few minutes an example of a specific problem I was up against, and a lot of navigating that problem was, or getting my bearings navigating that problem was asking why. So adopting that constant mindset of I don't know, not being afraid to ask why. Those are tools for changing our mental perspective, right? We can also life hack it a little bit, and literally change our perspective, change our visual perspective. There have been some studies that have suggested that getting up and working in the kitchen instead of your office can be enough of a change to trigger the creative juices to start flowing again. There's a study out of Stanford that says taking walks of, I think, 20 minutes to 30 minutes are phenomenal for creativity, increasing creativity as much as up to 60%. Also, it's just good for you. So these kinds of things can help you cheat your way physically into mentally changing your perspective as well. This is a more technical exercise, and this is something I go through for moderate or harder, more persistent difficulties and problems I have. I call this my IVR loop. We'll walk you through it in a second here. I don't always do it with pen and paper, although I often do for the harder problems. But it starts with, like I mentioned earlier, taking stock of what you know or assume, right? Without a sort of foundation and orientation, we can't really proceed. It also helps just keeping track of things as we start checking things off our diagnostic checklist and exploring problems. So take stock of what you know or assume. Pick something, pick one of those assumptions, pick those facts, and test it, right? Make sure it's actually the case and drive that confidence as far as you can. And then, once you've done your test, do it again, right? Write down what's changed, modify things a little bit, and do this until the problem's solved, or do this until you're comfortable with your understanding. When I do this, like I said, take a very technical approach to this. I start mapping my ideas out. So on the x-axis, we have the mapping of detail. Things I know to a high level of detail go on the right. Things I know in name only, or I know they exist, or I'm kind of familiar with them, but not really, go on the left. Things I'm very confident about, obviously, go high. Things that I'm not entirely certain about, go low. So we'll get into a specific example of this. I apologize, this is a dev-centric problem because this is what I run into often in my professional life. I was dealing with a serialization and deserialization issue. So that is the act of taking an in-memory object and converting it into a consistent, representable, sometimes human-readable, but consistent, savable format so that it can later be consumed by other services, applications, things like that. And it was with Java and Spring Boot, so I had some good idea of where I was, but not entirely. And I apologize, this is a little small. So in the top right, I've got the assumption that my configuration is correct. I know this because I know what the expected output of the options I put in are supposed to be, right? I know what I'm looking to get. I know I've put them in right. I've spell checked. I've done everything I possibly can. And I know this to a high level of detail. To the left, but a little higher up, I know for a damn fact that Jackson is the library in my application that's responsible for serialization and deserialization. You'll notice it's almost all the way to the left because I'm really not terribly familiar with it. When you're working in Spring Boot, which is what we were working in, you're really not supposed to have to think about that. It's annotation driven, it's declarative, you just kind of set it and forget it. So I don't know about it because I don't have to. In the bottom left, I have the fact or assumption that my configuration is working correctly. This is in the bottom left because I really don't know how this configuration makes it to Jackson and parts of my application. And furthermore, I don't know how to test it, right? It's not exactly easy to make sure that this is propagating down all the way to to where it needs to be. So this is the approach I took. Started top left, and it's not always like this. We'll explain the various values of where to start and where to begin. But I started top left. I started looking into how Jackson works, trying to understand exactly what it does. Am I instantiating something wrong? Am I using a class incorrectly? What do these classes even do? If any of you guys have ever seen Java, especially enterprise level Java, the memes are all true. They're all true. You have class names that are like 15 words long, and it's all just a bunch of abstract ideas thrown together. That's confusing, and that's why Jackson has stayed in the far left of that graph for quite some time. So I began to dive into it a little bit, and by the end I was able to move it maybe a little bit more to the middle, but I didn't really know, or I didn't really find the solution for my problem in there. So then I said, okay, well, let's get a little deeper. Let's check that my configuration is working correctly. So I began to look at how these configuration sources are parsed, what the order is, what the order assigned to them is. So, are there overrides and things of that nature? We even got into the real basics of doing our print line statements, and that gave something away. In that case, I didn't actually have to proceed any further, but if I would have gone up to validate what I had previously validated, because that was really all I had left at this point. The reason that I took that particular approach for that particular problem was about weighing the effort, the risks, the payoff. So, often kind of looks like this. The things that you know, the known knowns, in great detail, are low effort to verify, right? I mean, obviously you know them in a great amount of detail. So it's pretty easy to check that. Because of that, and because you're very confident that they are the case, the reward there is not likely to be high. It's probably not the source of your problem. Then again, some people advocate for checking this every time, right? Check your physical layer before going all the way up. Things that you are very confident of, but know in name only or are unfamiliar with, take a little bit more effort, and aren't likely to be terribly rewarding. But if that's something that you feel might benefit you in the future, you might start with exploring the things that you know abstractly, rather than digging into the hardest effort stuff first. Things you're not entirely certain of and things that you're not terribly familiar with are, of course, the highest effort, right? You both have to explore, how do I do this? What is this idea? And how do I verify that this idea is correct? Because of this, it's very high effort, and because of this, it's also very high reward. Even if you don't find the solution for your problem there, you've obviously gained more confidence in something that you were previously relying on, and more understanding of something that you were relying on. Not every problem needs that solution, right? If I didn't feel like I was going to be fighting configuration issues or using Jackson again, or this particular part of Jackson, I really wouldn't care. That wasn't the case, and this was a pivotal part of the application and would be a pivotal part of many more. So there was definitely value in not just exploring that to get the solution to my problem, but having that understanding for later. And then finally, things that you are very confident of, or pardon me, not tremendously confident of, but know in fairly high detail, are obviously, again, low effort to check because you know either it's there or it's not. But it is, there is potentially moderate reward there as well. My last big recommendation kind of feels like cheating a little bit. And that's because I recommend this, and psychologists and people far more qualified than me will recommend this as a solution to any mental tendency that one might wish to change or modify about themselves. Once again, I'm not going to ask you to sell all your possessions and live in a forest monastery. Mindfulness meditation is a methodical approach, and unlike the others, it's not something you do in the trenches, right? This is not something, if you're in the middle of an outage and trying to figure something out, maybe don't disappear for 20 minutes and, do your it's, maybe. I mean, maybe you've got that environment, but probably not. Instead, this is a good habit to develop, and this falls firmly in the realm of hacker self-care. I know Indy's own Ms. Bat is very fond of talking about hacker self-care. I highly recommend it. I can't recommend it enough. We need our brains to be sharp. Let's take care of them, and this is probably one of the easiest ways to do it. Mindfulness meditation is a purely secular form of meditation. There's no weird stuff if that's not what you're into. There's no ascension. There's no spirit journeys. Purely secular exercise, which is designed to cultivate awareness about the self, both physical, mental, the immediate environment. And this, like you may have noticed, a lot of our recommendations start with taking stock of what we know. This is how we do that with the more abstract concept of emotions, ideas, ego, that kind of thing. And then there's a handful of other things that we can do. All of these are, I could go on for a long time. These are just simple, methodical approaches that we can take. Tying reward to curiosity. Again, that optimal arousal theory that we were talking about earlier states that we can be motivated to drive reward from curious, exploratory behaviors. So sync those pathways up in your brain, right? If you do go out and learn something that's particularly hard or particularly new or particularly challenging, treat yourself. You deserve it. And if you do that enough, we'll get real Pavlovian in our responses and learn to kind of corroborate that idea of, okay, I want something, I'm going to do something to earn it. Grabbing a friend, explaining the problem, explaining what you know, the explain like I'm 5 approach. If you don't have a friend, do as I do and grab your rubber ducky. And this is obviously, if you can't explain a problem, if you can't teach a concept, how well do you really know it? And this has been hammered home by, again, people much smarter than me time and time again. So making sure that you can walk through it will help reinforce your understanding. And if you have a hiccup, great. That's something that you now get to explore. Read what interests you, right? And this is kind of combining 2 bullet points. But for me, it's kernel exploits. Kernel exploits are hard, man. Like that shit is complicated. And I love it. I cannot read most kernel exploit write-ups straight through. It will take me about 4 or 5 or 6 iterations to get through and finally feel like I understand it, because I'll get about 10, 20, 30% in and say, I have no idea what's going on right now. I'm going to go figure this out. And sometimes it sticks, and that's why I do it a lot, because sometimes it doesn't until it gets hammered home time and time again. So focus on the things that you care about, especially if you're trying to cultivate curiosity and exploration outside of your professional sphere, right? It's great to want to improve in our professional lives, advance in our career, but if that's all we focus on, that can be a trap for us, and that's a huge risk for burnout. So again, treat yourself and learn about the things that you want to learn more about. Or take a different approach. Focus on things you have no idea about. Maybe you still definitely want to learn about these things, but go crazy. This is one of the ideas that I stole from Lost's talk. This is one of the things he does on I think, yearly basis. He takes 2 articles from fields he knows nothing about and reads them until he understands them. 2 magazines. Thank you. And that helps him both obviously understand things that he might never have understood before, but understand things that he does know and combine ideas that he does know differently. I can verify it's the same for me, right? So go out and do something that you've got no idea about and see where that leads you. Again, because we talk about curiosity being akin to a creativity problem, one of the best time-tested methods I've ever seen for getting past writer's block, creator's block, is just arbitrary restrictions, right? Pick something and say, I can't do this, right? And then see how you will proceed. The guy that wrote the Moveficator, I don't know how he arrived at it, but I'm sure that one day he woke up and said, what if they were all move instructions? And he did it, and it's awesome and terrifying. And that's the rule that he decided he wanted to follow for that particular project. And I haven't spoken to him personally, but I'm certain that he learned a great deal from that. No. Oh my God. How did I miss that? I'm gonna need to watch that. And I will put that in the revised slide notes then. Another one for arbitrary restrictions, and this is from my music background again as well. Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt put out this deck of cards called Oblique Strategies. And it's weird. It's really weird, but it's really interesting. And it was a sort of tool to help get people through creative blocks or ruts. And some of these are useful for us. Some of these are definitely for creative only endeavors. But things like use an old idea or state the problem in words as clearly and simply as possible. Are all sorts of little axioms that will appear on these cards. You can get it, the original ones are out of print, I think, anymore, and the print versions are expensive. But you can find apps on your phone that do the exact same thing, and they're a really neat way of just kind of like, oh, I don't know what I want to do. Sometimes it helps to have somebody else push you in that direction. So we're a little bit early, but wrapping it all up. Curiosity, like I said, is akin to a creativity problem. And the difficulty with solving those problems is it can seem a little bit intangible, right? I mean, we're all IT people. We like things that we can logically descend down through. So do that for your curiosity. Make your fixes, make your approach to curiosity to learning methodical. Make it actionable, right? Maybe some of the ideas that I've presented today will work for you. Maybe you go out and learn how you learn and say, well, that was stupid, but I've got my own method now. So that's all you need. Figuring out that you're walking through a method, that you're walking through a process, can force you to apply that when you're stuck in a rut and you really don't know where to go, or you just have no idea where you're at. So learn to leverage your ego, your assumption, your experience, because those can be impediments. And when you get them all in balance, they're not, and you're operating optimally and life's good. So taking stock of where those are at as well. Am I overinflated? Am I unsure in my abilities? Am I assuming too much? Is there something, how big are my blind spots, right? So with that being said, go out and learn something. That's what we're here for, right? I have never met a person in this field who has not claimed to be some sort of lifelong learner. And if you think you're not, you actually are. You're just not admitting it to yourself yet. Because that's what we're here to do. And frankly, this field is always evolving, so we really don't have any other option than to go on and continue learning. So, particularly for the rest of the con, if you come out and see me and you learn something interesting, come find me and tell me about it, because I want to hear about it too, and maybe I'll buy you a beer, if you're of age. Guys, I will have these slides posted. They will be on my Twitter. I think I'm going to put them on Mega. These are a few resources that either I'm reading right now, I'm checking out right now, were given to me, or inspired parts of this talk. So, if you're interested in exploring more about it, come up to talk to me, of course, or check some of these out when they get posted. Any comments, questions? All right, thank you guys.